This is surely a first for me to spend an afternoon in a lounge bar cum restaurant with three tax experts. Look at the length we go to try and make tax conversations and our pre-budget programming interesting to all you viewers here. And the reason we probably have to do it this year is that several people expect the finance minister himself will do very few interesting things in the budget in the context of the fact that we expect the direct tax code to become effective next year, or at least that seems to be the majority expectation as of now. And he's got a very tight balancing act between inflation and growth, which will mean that he may choose not to tinker with taxes at all. But is that really going to be the case? I am going to put those questions to Ajay Lalwani. He's the co-chairman of the Direct Taxation Committee of the Bombay Chambers, DM Muthukumaran, who is the head of corporate finance at the Aditya Birla Group, and Uday Ved, who is the head of taxation at KPMG. So Ajay, Muthu and Uday, thank you very much for joining me on the second episode of Taxing Times. I'm going to start with you first, Ajay. There are several macro drivers that will impact the decision that Pranab Mukherjee takes on headline rates, on the big direct tax rates. He's got inflation on one hand, which caps his ability to increase rates by fear of passing on, sort of enhancing the inflationary pressures. But he's also got revenue pressures on the other hand, considering that this year we have no 3G sort of big kick-in coming in. And so where is he going to raise the additional revenue from to meet his fiscal deficit targets? That's if we progress or continue to progress on the path of fiscal consolidation. So in the context of all of this and the fact that the DTC could become reality April 1st next year, do you believe there will be any changes in the headline rates of direct taxation?
Frankly, I don't think one can expect too many changes per se in this coming budget for the simple reason that we will have once the DTT kicks off,
right,
is something which is already announced,
which is 30%.
Which is 30%.
Right.
We are already very close to 30%
right now.
Right now. So therefore, the end goal being clear, I don't see any tinkering, any major tinkering that might happen with the rates. You could have some relief in the form of surcharges being done away with, etc. But that's about it.
That's correct. I agree with that analysis. There was mention in the last budget about the tax rate being carefully chosen, and there was also rollbacks in indirect taxes last year, and there was a lot of mention about fiscal discipline. More importantly, you can see the undertone in the last budget as well, that growth is paramount. So it appears to me that given that DTC is coming in next year or two, we would actually expect the tax rate to remain unaffected at this point in time.
No changes in headline rates, are there?
No, I agree with what both Muthu and Ajay are saying. But if you see the history on last few years in terms of the tax rates, it's a history of falling tax rates, right? And doing away with the incentives. And that's what I think is being planned also under the new DTC, which will come into effect from 2012.
Final draft of DTC says 30%.
Final draft is 30%.
Right.
And in that sense, if you look at that, to go from 30 to anything below in this year's budget is very, very unlikely. I think it is not possible. What I would believe would be that possibly the surcharge and cess should be logically removed to do a transition towards the 30% rate for the DTC.
So get to 30% this year itself, so that there is no change between this year and next year.
Very competitive globally also.
Is it really very competitive globally, Ajay? Because I know that one of the things you wanted to raise was that considering that profit-linked incentives are going away, will the government provide a roadmap for in fact reducing rates from that 30% level over the course of the next 5-7 years, right?
Yeah. Actually, my personal feeling is that once you take away the incentives, today the tax collection which the government really talks about on corporate profits is to the order of 21% on an average on corporate profits, and therefore it's really the incentives which are bringing down the average
effective
collection.
Tax rate, right?
But that being the case, it is a stated position that incentives will go.
Right.
It could taper off, so therefore it may not go immediately because there is this grandfathering which has been provided for. But eventually you will have a situation where there will be no incentives. Now, given that situation, I think the tax rates could or should ideally come down, and I say this because it's not just the 33% of the corporate tax that we are talking of, it's the dividend distribution tax added on, which is at 16.6%. So the combination of two really works out to 42.7% for an investor. So when somebody is looking to invest, after a stage where you make your profits, the amount of taxes that you pay,
Right.
your profit tax as well as the dividend distribution tax, is to the order of 42%. Now, which I think if you compare with tax rates in some of the neighboring countries, is pretty high. For example, the tax rates in Singapore, Hong Kong, or even Taiwan are around 17%. Similarly, China, Indonesia, Malaysia, or one or two other such countries, the tax rate is around 25%. Some of these countries don't have a tax on dividends.
Right.
So that's the final tax that you pay. And some of them where you do have dividend tax, it's to the order of 5 or 10%. So
Not as high as
it
we
doesn't
have it here in
add up
India.
to what we are talking of.
But what do you expect then the government will do? Do you really think that they will deal with this by reducing the headline corporate tax rate, or they might deal with it by tinkering with dividend distribution tax, or they might choose to do neither, considering that they really do need the revenue this year if they want to meet their deficit targets?
Sure. So one doesn't really expect them to take up these measures immediately.
Okay.
But if they could signal a roadmap as to going forward, given that the incentives are going, given that there is already growth and buoyancy in the system, tax collections are showing a 40% growth. So with that macroeconomic enabler, so to say, there is a case for reducing tax rates.
The effective rate today, because of the profit-linked incentives, is at 21%. When that gets replaced with investment-based incentives, how much will the effective rate come back up to? Not all the way back to 33, right?
Certainly not.
Yeah, so
No.
24, 25%.
Yeah, somewhere there.
And then
Also-
you add on the dividend distribution tax.
That's right. Also,
Okay.
Menka, you must realize investment-based incentive is actually nothing but a deferment of tax.
It's an accelerated
it's an
depreciation
accelerated
that you're providing,
depreciation.
yeah.
So, in that sense, yes, it would help in the initial years, in the formative years,
Right.
in terms of tax saving. But over the years, you are where you are.
Okay, let me turn this around. You know, we're constantly looking at this from the point of view of the DTC, in fact, becoming effective April 1st next year. But it is a legislative process, and as we know through experience in this country, few legislative processes are able to stick to timetables. What if the DTC was not likely to become effective next year? The finance minister knows this based on the time that the standing committee is taking to collect inputs and go through the debate once again. He may not choose to publicly acknowledge that it's getting delayed, but he may say, okay, I still have a year or two to play around before the DTC comes into play. Then do you think that there might be some big changes in headline rates?
See, from my point of view, no.
We still have 1 year time. So today to make that possible statement that there would be a reduction in the rate would be inconsistent with what the finance ministry is planning, right? So today you have to have DTC come into force on April 1, 2012 when the rate is 30%. Now, if you for a moment reduce from 30 to marginally 27.5, which was being discussed, or maybe 25 on an extreme basis, you can't go back to 30 if the rate was to, DTC was to come into force in 2012.
All right.
So I would believe on a immediate basis in this year's budget, except the surcharge, and so effectively you might reduce 3% from 33.22 to 30, so 3% reduction. The base rate I don't think can change. Yes, medium to long term, maybe
Right.
over a period. Whether DTC comes into picture or not, some of or large parts of these provisions will come into force in the in the original act itself if DTC was not to come into force. And in that situation, yes, you could go from 30 to maybe on a little long-term basis, maybe close to 25, assuming the incentives are taken away. But if you have these incentives being carried forward, and even for those incentives, you have the expenditure being based incentives, which will take a base rate of 20% for minimum alternate tax. So there was going to be a minimum 20% tax, which what Ajay said, today's average rate is about 20-21%. So at the most it could go to 25, but I won't believe in the near future.
As far as headline rates go then, our panelists believe there will be no change in rates with the exception of maybe a minor lowering to 30%. What then can the finance minister do when it comes to stimulating growth in this economy? Because India Inc. seems to be facing a difficult year. We'll discuss that on the other side of this commercial break. Welcome back. You're watching Taxing Times. If there is likely to be no change in the headline rates of taxation, direct tax that is, then what growth levers or growth buttons can the finance minister push through tax policy to help industry try and achieve stronger growth this year? Ajay, there are several issues sector-wise, if one was to go to, several sectors asking for special SOPs, incentives, a continuation of the export incentives that the IT industry has been asking for, or a change in or an extension of the incentives for power projects. What do you expect will likely be the big changes that he can make without disturbing headline rates and help sort of industry which is struggling with higher input costs, inflation, and maybe even lower demand this year?
I think nothing much on the direct tax front, frankly, for the simple reason that the structure is already in place in terms of direct taxes, and the going forward position is also on the table in terms of the DTC.
Then let me come to the issue of exemptions. I think there are some expectations or demands, at least, for the extension of the export incentives that we have for a year, assuming DTC becomes effective next year. I think there are similar expectations with regards to power projects where the exemption expires this year, and people are saying, can you extend it up to April 1st, 2012? So do you think those are realistic expectations?
I absolutely think so. There is a case for doing, otherwise for this 1 year, the projects executed in this 1 year will lose out the exemption forever.
Right.
And so clearly there is a case whether, as Muthu said, whether it's a profit-based incentive or an investment-based incentive, certainly for power project, which is ending on March 11. When the DTC was coming into force on March 11, there was a consistency. Now there is a 1 year gap. And the other thing that you mentioned about infrastructure, which is I think a need of the hour. And over the next 3 to 5 years, there would be huge amount of money, close to maybe $500 billion or whatever that number could be is going to be spent. And there was this tax exemption for investing in an infrastructure project. So if you had an external commercial borrowings and you paid interest out of that, there was an exemption many years back, which was withdrawn at some point of time. And I would believe there is a case for reinstating that. This will really also augment the funding aspect that the government may go through, as you were saying. How do you generate the funds? And this could be one way of doing it. So whether a complete exemption or currently the withholding tax on interest is 20%, reduce it to 10%, reduce 10% and increase the tenor of the bond for say maybe more than 10 years, something like that. But certainly I think something of that sort would encourage, because a lot of funding is going to come from foreign investors.
Okay, what's the case with MAT, Ajay? I know that's one request that's on the table and has been represented to the finance minister. What do you hope will change? Do you really think it will?
Menka, the chamber has all along been representing, and actually it's worked the other way. Based on inputs from the industry, we have, firstly, why did we have MAT? We had MAT to bring to tax certain companies who were not paying tax, zero tax.
Yeah.
But look at the way it's progressed. We started off with a minimum tax of 7.5%. That was at a time when the taxes used to be somewhat higher. We are, on the profit tax front down to 33% now. But the way MAT has progressed, it's moved from 7.5% to way up to close to 20% now.
I think the DTC proposes 20%.
Yes,
it's currently at 18.5 or 19
plus surcharge takes it up to pretty
almost
much close
same,
to
yes.
20%. Now with MAT at 20% and your normal tax at 30%
right.
Where is can you really call it a minimum tax when you're trying to recover 20% of the earnings?
So it's a maximum alternate levy, yes.
The two reasons why MAT came into play was because of the difference in book profits and the tax profits,
right.
which was largely on account of tax incentives and the depreciation differences.
Absolutely.
Incentives, we know, are going away. Your depreciation differences have come down largely because the plant and machinery rates, the general rate is down from 33% to 25% to now 15%. So the difference is disappearing. And therefore, the whole thing of there being a zero tax company looks, you could have initial years losses, etc., and therefore you could still have a MAT situation arising. But certainly the rate at 20% seems high, and therefore our request was that you link it to the corporate tax rate. So if the corporate tax rate is 30%,
right.
you could probably on the higher side or maximum have it at 50% of the rate. So that it's self-calibrated. The moment the rate changes, your MAT rate also comes down.
Okay.
And there's no further interference required.
So is that something you expect he will address this year? Because I know this has been a pending demand for a while,
yes.
exacerbated by the fact that the DTC proposed 20%.
Absolutely. Now, given that only last year they took it up from 15 to 18%, it would be too much of a flip-flop for them to
bring it back down this year, right? Is this a big issue there? Because, if incentives are going to fall off when the DTC becomes effective, really how many companies continue to be then in the MAT net and for how long? And hence, should the FM be spending a large amount of his time thinking about what to do with MAT?
I think I don't think so. Maybe 18 may remain as 18 or it might go to 20. But nothing more than that.
Both of you have a different opinion on this, or should I move on to the dividend distribution tax issue?
Sure. No, I don't have a different view. I think it's, as you rightly said, it's probably not an issue that requires a lot of attention.
So can we come back to then the other oft-repeated issue of dividend distribution tax and the constant allegation that this is a double tax on companies? Please do something to deal with it.
I hope he addresses. As I said, there is a case as to why you will have chain of companies in India. I mean, these are nothing to do with taxation.
Right.
These are business exigencies. You may have it for the reasons on financing. You may have it for the reasons of joint ventureship, for projects being in a separate companies. So the chain of companies by itself is a requirement and has been a requirement for a long time. So there is a strong case why we should probably adapt a structure where, some time ago we used to have this ATM concept where as long as you pay the dividend in the same year, it keeps getting exempted under the fundamental principle that we don't want to tax the same income more than once.
Right.
So I think there is a strong case for that to actually come back.
What do you expect?
I would say some moderation on the
Rates.
dividend tax rate.
How much would you like it lowered by?
I think it should be taken back in steps to 10%, which is where we started.
It's currently at 16, 15?
Currently at 16.6 with the surcharge.
So take it back to 10%.
10%. You see, when it was introduced, it was supposed to be a simpler method of collecting tax on dividends. So instead of taxing numerous shareholders on small amounts,
Right.
10% was taken to be a revenue neutral rate where the government thought that it's simpler to pick up that money from the companies and let us not chase the small shareholders. If that indeed was the philosophy, and if 10% was supposed to be the revenue neutral rate, then there is absolutely no reason why it should have been taken up all the way to 16.6.
Okay, so do you think it will come down to 10% or there? And add to that, I think the other demand that you all want, which is to do away with the tax on foreign dividends, right?
So I would believe reducing from 15 to 10 looks unlikely, and this is a South African model that was followed in 1997 when the DTT was changed from a shareholder base to a company base,
Right.
and that has continued over the last 13 years, and that seems to be the case even going forward. So I don't know whether, or I don't think that he can reduce it from 15 back to 10. That would be, I think, maybe a massive kind of a tax erosion in that sense.
So he's already negated two demands, right? Both on MAT and on DDT. I think, Uday is saying it's not going to
unlikely,
happen. Right?
Unlikely. Certainly on the foreign dividends, as an example, there is a case to make it, and this has been said in the past also. So for Indian companies going global, if you have a foreign subsidiary which declares dividends and pays it back to the Indian parent, right? Whereas in the Indian case, the tax would have been 15% or 16% including surcharge. In case of foreign dividend, you pay a normal tax because that the taxation is still on the shareholder. And you pay a full rate of 30 or 33% including that. And there is clearly a case to equalize with the DDT rate, whether it is 15 or
10, which is unlikely, but 15, 16. Yes.
Yeah, I would say it would be 15.
So, gentlemen, I think when we talk about trying to, a tax policy that helps stimulate growth, the only thing we've actually come down to, which you believe is realistically possible, is a 1-year extension of the profit-linked incentives and a 1-year extension maybe of the investment-linked incentives for the power sector. And whilst we want MAT and DDT to change, Uday tells us it's unrealistic to expect that to happen. So nothing else will happen when it comes to stimulating growth. Is that right?
Yeah, from the point of view of stimulating growth, probably you're right. But, the purpose of budget and taxation focus is also on administrative issues in a budget. So a lot could be done with respect to that.
For instance?
I'll quote an example. There is this withholding tax issue.
Okay.
Until about 2002, if I remember right, there was an exemption on withholding tax with respect to interest paid on foreign borrowings or external commercial borrowings.
Right.
Today, realistically, we as borrowers in the corporates are never able to get the ultimate credit for these withholding tax, and it ends up being grossed up, and we end up actually paying interest as well as the withholding tax on those interests. for some reasons, practical and administrative, we are not able to, get the credit for it. So it will be useful if actually government, for example, addresses this issue.
Unfortunately, it's not the headline making part of the budget. It's not what gets channels like us excited, though it does impact your day-to-day life. On that, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we will talk about the potential of one big headline coming out of this budget. I hate to say it, at one time it was a four-letter word, and for the last 2 years we've been talking about an amnesty scheme. We'll come back and discuss if there's any likely potential of that happening this year. Welcome back. You're watching Taxing Times. Several years ago, it was a four-letter word, VDIS, if I remember correctly, and it's back to haunt us last year as well as this year. What are the likelihood or the chances?
Frankly, I hope something like this doesn't happen because it's absolutely unfair.
Last time when the scheme came, which was VDIS, Voluntary Disclosure Scheme, it was in 1987. I think government had given some kind of commitment at that point of time. And I think it would be absolutely unfair. So it could be a moral answer, but I think that's the way it is.
That's the ideological opposition. I'm asking you, practically, do you believe that it's a solution that the FM will consider?
I don't think it will happen.
Then let me come to what Uday has suggested as maybe the possibility of introducing a one-time settlement scheme that helps settle the several thousand litigations which have several thousand crore rupees stuck in them by offering a one-time plea bargain or a one-time let's buy some peace opportunity, and thereby recovering lots of the locked money in those disputes. How much money do you think something like that can release in terms of revenue, and will that be a key driver for why they consider this settlement scheme?
I would think that one thing is it's generating revenue. Second is just killing the litigation, which is clearly one of the key objectives of the government in the act as well as going forward in the DTC. So you would have indirect taxes more than 100,000 crores, something like that, of taxes being locked at various levels, be it at appeal level or tribunal or a high court or a supreme court. And there are a lot of issues which are recurring issues. It just continues.
Yeah.
So there could be a one-time kind of a amnesty in that sense. If the corporates want to just buy peace, does not mean that they accept it and come and say, okay, pay the headline rate of 30%, no interest, no penalty. And I think that could be one way of addressing a part of the fiscal deficit. I don't know how much amount it will get generated, but certainly it would reduce litigation to a large extent.
Is this one of those great ideas that we talk about every year, and there's no real need for it to be introduced in any one specific year?
No, actually, when you even at the state level, when you transition from one set of law to another, it's good to have some measure to clean up the old litigation that you've collected. So I think introduction of DTC could be a good time to then offer a scheme where you just close all your cases under the old Income Tax Act, and in the bargain, if you can release or if you can collect the taxes which are blocked, I think it's a win-win.
Muthu, this is the tax department's version of consent orders and compounding.
That's correct, but I wouldn't think this, if it comes, will come because you want to collect money. I think it will come because if you want to get rid of the cases.
Alright, so Uday, you want to wrap up what you expect the FM will say with regards to direct taxes on 28th of this month?
I think it has been made public that there's not going to be any major tax reform, because otherwise the entire DTC loses the steam. And if we see those changes in this budget, if at all, one should assume that the DTC is going to die, which I don't think government wants to do it at this point of time. And so, because considering all that aspects, it will be more a balancing act, carrying on for one more year, and hopefully when the DTC comes into the force with a 3% tax rate or maybe going forward a little reduction, I think the budget, even from a taxation perspective, possibly will become a non-event.
All right, then we'll let that be the last word on this discussion. Ajay, Muthu, Uday, thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for watching. And a final thank you to our location hosts, that's Shiro, for hosting this discussion on direct taxes and making taxes look that much more interesting or sexy. We'll see you next week when we discuss indirect taxes and whether any changes are expected there.